This is the Common Health Podcast, a product of the CSIS Bipartisan Alliance for Global Health Security. We engage with diverse leaders on the question of how best to navigate this period of exceptional turmoil, reform, and uncertainty in U.S. leadership. We are aided throughout by our able producer, Marla Hiller. I'm delighted today to be joined again by Peggy Hamburg. Thank you, Peggy, for joining us.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Peggy's an American physician, public health administrator. During the Biden administration, she served on the Foreign Policy Advisory Board to Secretary Blinken, and she was vice chair of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. She currently still serves as co-president of the Inter-Academy Partnership. Previous to that, she's occupied many key roles in public health. From 2009 until 2015 was the FDA Commissioner. Prior to that, she was an assistant secretary for planning evaluation in HHS during the Clinton administration, and prior to that as commissioner of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, 91 to 97. Thank you so much. We're here predominantly to speak about FDA. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but tell us a bit more about your remarkable personal story, Peggy. Like, how did this happen?
Well, I definitely ended up following a career path that I never intended, nor did I imagine it. I grew up in an academic community. My parents were both professors at Stanford University in the medical school, and I grew up right on the campus as a faculty brat. I thought I wanted to go into academic medicine myself, and I thought I would train in medicine and then do some specialty in endocrinology. But what happened was that during the course of my medical training, I watched the HIV/AIDS epidemic emerge. And, literally the first year of medical school, learning that the era of infectious diseases was more or less behind us due to the advent of vaccines and antibiotics, and then watching this mysterious and really quite terrifying disease emerge that no one knew what it was. No one knew what was causing it. No one knew even what to call it. And we certainly didn't know how to treat it. And eventually, during the course of my medical training, we learned more. And by the time I did my medical residency in New York, I was taking care of many, many patients with HIV/AIDS, but we couldn't treat them. It was supportive care, and most with serious disease were unable to leave the hospital. They died, and we even lost one of our fellow residents. It had a profound impact on me watching all of this and noting both that we had no medical treatments to offer that were meaningful, but also seeing the social, legal, economic, political issues that were connected with this emerging disease threat. And it really opened up my eyes. It made me wanted to work at the intersection of science, medicine, public health, and politics. And that was when I went down to Washington, D.C. to sort of learn about the world of policy. At the time, my chair of medicine said, if you're not back in 2 years to do your subspecialty training, you will have thrown away your entire medical career. I did not return in 2 years for that subspecialty training. And the great irony was that 10 years later, he called me and said, I'm really interested in health policy. Can you help me? So that's sort of how I started off on this pathway. I have found it to be enormously gratifying on a personal level because, I feel that while I miss the patient contact day to day, I have been able to be engaged with some of the most pressing and time urgent issues in science and health of our time, and hopefully have some positive impact that has made a difference for people here in this country and around the world.
Thank you. I mean, I'm struck by the profundity of the HIV epidemic in the way that it changed the trajectory of life. The same thing happened to Julie Gerber.
And we knew each other back then.
Same thing happened to Peter Piot. Same thing happened to Tony Fauci. I mean, the accounts of people's lives, and one of the net results was that across a generation of emerging experts and talent, it led to just this very unusual continuity of commitment to public health and policy over now 5 decades.
Absolutely.
I don't think we oftentimes recognize the way in which that epidemic drove that shift of decisions about, it were very personal about people's career pathways.
People's careers, and I think also how we did our work. I think it was a profound illustration of how you can't just do science and health in isolation, but you need to engage. So the need for, cross discipline and cross sector and cross border engagement to address a serious problem. It also, for me, opened up my eyes to the importance of really listening and learning and rethinking,
Right.
Some of the dogma about how to do things and how to address problems. Because it was the AIDS activists who really,
Change science.
changed science
Yes.
and in positive ways. Once we stopped trying to keep them away and let them in and they sat at the table and had meaningful discussions, they came to understand why we were doing certain aspects of science, both basic research and clinical research in certain ways, but they also made us think in new ways and, really had a profound impact on how clinical trials can be done in more flexible
Right.
and accelerated ways. They helped us think about the role of biomarkers and what is now accelerated
Right.
approval really
Mark
emerged
Harrington
from that. Yeah. So it was really, really important, and it changed me as a public health and medical professional, and it changed me as a leader as well.
Thank you. Let's shift to FDA, Food and Drug Administration. Let's start with some very basic questions like what does it do and why does that matter?
Well, FDA is an amazing agency, and I do think it's underappreciated, misunderstood in many ways. And even when I went there, it wasn't a job I had sought. It was a job that the White House asked me to do. And boy, am I grateful, because it is such an important and unique organization. I kind of went to it thinking, as I think many people do, that it was kind of a bureaucratic organization where the science that was done wasn't cutting edge science, but it was sort of checklists, and that there was real reluctance to lean into decision making and a lot of rote activity. And it was so not the case. FDA is staffed by an extraordinary group of scientists, medical experts, policy experts, analysts, lawyers, and administrative support that makes the whole engine run. And importantly, there is no agency that does what FDA does, or private sector entity. And so FDA really plays a critical role. Often people don't know what we're doing. It's underappreciated, but FDA actually regulates products that account for some 20, maybe more percent of every dollar that consumers spend on products. They regulate drugs. They regulate vaccines and other biologics. They regulate medical devices and products that emit radiation. They regulate cosmetics and dietary supplements, or at least oversee and respond to quality concerns. They also regulate animal food and drugs, an important area for many American consumers. And during my tenure, we also took on the regulation of tobacco products, which was a major advance. The legislation passed in a strongly bipartisan way, and of course, addressing what remains the leading cause of preventable death, disease, and disability in this country and around the world.
Thank you. Now, we're in the midst, we're at whatever we are at, 115 days into since the inauguration in January 20th of President Trump's second term. The reorganization that's underway is not completed, a 19% cut in staffing. There's been the staffing rollouts have been unveiled in fairly abrupt, if not brutal fashion in different ways. There's still a lot of confusion about exactly what has been done, what has been reversed, what lies ahead. So trying to make an estimate of where do things stand with FDA? Is it going to be 30 or 40% smaller than what it was before? Will it be able to do the regulatory work, to issue guidance, to issue regulations? Will it retain its scientific capabilities? There's been Peter Marks resigned as RFK Jr. was coming in as Secretary of HHS. Peter Marks, who headed up the CBER, the Center for Biological Evaluation and Research, a very important role. Before we get into the tenure of Marty Makary, Dr. Makary's tenure now as the new FDA Commissioner, how are you thinking about this process? Because we've got opinion across a spectrum of exactly what's going on, and there's a lot of confusion about this. How do you think about where we are today, just in big picture on the reforms and changes underway?
It is very worrisome what's happening at FDA and at other agencies of government as well. It is still early days, and we know that there has been a lot of destruction. There's no other word for it, but there's been so much turmoil, and we know many employees have been fired, and that is deeply worrisome. Many of the seasoned leaders across FDA are now gone. It's not just Peter Marks. And we know that many of the critical administrative support positions that enable important scientific, medical, and regulatory work to go forward aren't there. And that's a huge problem. But it's very hard to really tell quite where we are till the dust settles. I think there is no doubt that we're going to see impacts from this near term and probably long term in terms of slowing of reviews, disruption of processes, probably gaps in FDA's ability to do certain of its critical functions in terms of laboratory assessments of food, for example, inspections of facilities, and, importantly, our ability to meet some of the new goals that this administration is defining. As I look at the situation, and as I said, we kind of have to wait for the dust to settle a little bit to see where we are. But as I look at it, I feel there's some huge disconnects between new mandates and defined goals and objectives and what has been done to the staffing and the internal workings of the agency to enable it to actually respond.
So let's take a few examples of that. For instance, there's been an announcement early May, 6th of May, by the White House about a change in unannounced inspections, that this will be overseas.
Yeah.
And you were a pioneer in getting FDA capabilities in China and India and elsewhere up and running. There's an argument on the part of Dr. McCary and others that there's a bias, that there's a gap between the intensity of inspections done on an unannounced basis in the United States, and we're going to do that, and that is meant to capture bad guys that better know what may be happening, increase the safety and public health quality for American consumers, correct that bias. Is that one area where you're saying, well, you can't take away your inspection staff and expect to be able to do expanded capabilities?
Absolutely. As you know, this was an arena where I spent a lot of time as commissioner. It was one of my top priorities because, in fact, on both the medical product and the food side, the supply chains are very complicated. They involve products that come in whole or in part from other countries around the world. And FDA does have an obligation to go in and inspect and know what's going on and to ensure the quality of these products as they move through these supply chains. Inspections overseas are much harder to do and much more expensive. You have to have special support for international inspections, and you have to address them in a somewhat different way than in the United States because many of the places that you're inspecting aren't as accustomed to having inspectors. They don't want inspectors. And there has been historically a difference in terms of less of an open door. In the U.S., most places understand that this is their obligation and they have to let you in. But, we had instances where, inspectors had to have security support even. And so it is worrisome because I don't think there is a fully realistic understanding of what it takes to do international inspections. We did where we had offices and where there were known issues. We didn't exclusively do inspections with lots of warning, always overseas, but it's hard to be in country without it being known that FDA inspectors were coming in. So it's hard to do them totally spontaneously in any case. But what's the bigger concern is that if you take away the people that are scheduling the travel and supporting people, inspectors that are going overseas, you're not going to be able to do more with less. In addition, I'm told, inspectors are very concerned that if they go over under these circumstances, they may have to pay out of pocket and they may never see that money because of the disruptions in funding streams and the uncertainty about cuts to FDA. So there are a lot of disincentives to doing more foreign inspections and doing them faster. there needs to be a reconciling of that.
Thank you. There's a couple of other areas that I want you to comment on. I mean, there's been a very bold claim that from Dr. McCary that FDA will scale the use of AI across all of its component elements by June 30th. That will eliminate mundane tasks that could be done through AI that are tedious and time-consuming and create greater efficiencies, but also seeking to leapfrog forward to create a kind of single unified approach that knits together all of the internal data platforms that are within FDA. They've appointed Jeremy Walsh as a chief AI officer. I don't know if that's the first chief AI officer at FDA or not, but this brings with it naturally, because it's AI, questions around privacy, questions around the hallucinations that are endemic to this, and the variability and outputs. And as you've suggested, the question of, are the staff in place that have the expertise and training to do this? What's your thoughts?
Clearly, AI can play a very positive and constructive role as applied to various tasks within the FDA, and I applaud the effort to examine that. I think the time frame is a little ambitious, and anyone that has worked a lot on IT issues and AI in particular has warned me that you need to go in a systematic way with pilot studies and testing and then integrating in. I think the confusing thing for most of us looking at this from the outside is that there's not much information on what do they really mean, where are they starting, fully integrated. I mean, surely that doesn't mean that every drug review will be done using AI as the first tool. But there are tasks where AI would be very well suited to help condense very large documents into excerpting critical information, some of the more administrative functions of checking to make sure that all the components of the so-called dossier are in place, identifying important questions potentially as well. But we really need to know more. Right now, we're operating from what's basically a new program initiative in press release form. And, certainly if you're going to start thinking about using it to actually undertake the review of new products, it's important what data you're using to use the AI tool, and we don't know that. In addition, I think the question of how you would integrate it in to be able to have quality control, oversight, the kinds of assessments comparing the old strategy to the new strategy would be crucial. And I don't think that can all be undertaken and implemented by the end of June 30th. So I hope we'll go in a stepwise process. But I think, it's right to look at it. Ironically, when the administration first began and the first round of hiring happened, many of the newly hired experts in AI were actually fired because they were probationary. They were new hires, and so they were easy to fire. I think that mistake was recognized, and they're trying to bring people back. But also, one of the challenges FDA has in the AI area, but in so many other domains of activity, is that they are working at FDA because they care about the mission of promoting and protecting the health of American citizens and beyond. They're not getting paid as well as they could get if they worked in the private sector. They don't have the working conditions, and now they don't have job security, and they're working in an environment of enormous uncertainty. So implementing this will also require making sure that the right people as well as the right technology exists to make it work and actually serve the goal.
Thank you. Another very big, bold mission that's come through a presidential executive order is that FDA is now mandated to reduce the time for approval of domestic manufacturing capabilities in the United States. So the FDA is explicitly now seen as a tool of our industrial policy, so that the normal process of permitting and construction and financing for a new domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing would be 5 to 10 years. The president has said that permitting needs to be changed dramatically. The FDA is to play a lead role in trying to accelerate that. There's now meant to be a shift to favor U.S. domestic facilities versus facilities overseas, and there's a 180-day review that's been initiated around that. Say a bit about that. How much of a departure or addition is this to FDA mission?
Well, clearly, there is a need to have more domestic manufacturing of many essential products. It doesn't happen overnight. There also is a very clear need for the biopharma industry to advance its manufacturing techniques. And starting when I was commissioner and continuing, there was an effort to really look at how to bring more advanced manufacturing into the biopharma sector. This effort makes sense, but again, it has to be done in a systematic way. And there will be some opportunities to reduce certain aspects of the time frame, but you would never want it to be done in a haphazard way, just in the efforts of speed. And I think, again, we have to make sure that some of the cuts in personnel and expertise, human expertise within the agency, aren't at odds with the goal of being able to support accelerated construction and proper oversight of new manufacturing facilities. Certainly, many of the big pharma companies are now making new commitments to developing manufacturing facilities in the U.S., and FDA can and should work very closely with them to accelerate it as much as possible. And one of the truths of how FDA works best is when there is real coordination of FDA officials with the regulated sector. And another concern I have is that if you draw too bright a line, you actually, again, harm the very goal that you're trying to achieve, because drugs get developed more quickly from the R&D standpoint as well as the review standpoint if there have been ongoing conversations between the companies developing the product and the FDA officials who'll be overseeing it. And the same goes when you're talking about building new manufacturing capability or ensuring the ongoing production at facilities. And many of our U.S.-based manufacturing facilities are outdated and have caused issues in terms of quality concerns and shortages. So we not only need to build some new, but we also need to make sure that the facilities we have are meeting standards that can ensure safety and quality for the American people.
I've been struck by these announcements by major manufacturers of very big commitments to build out capabilities in the United States over the next 5, 7, 8 years. J&J, Eli Lilly, Novartis, Roche, there's several others. When you add these up, many of those were already in process. These had been planned out years before. Some of them are new, but they do add up to billions of dollars. So that's interesting. And much of that is in branded drugs, right?
Yes, the case is currently, and for quite a long time now, the majority of generic drugs are coming from overseas.
Right. I was also struck when this executive order came out, and with the focus on permitting, and that FDA is supposed to get out there and start helping with this. Well, when the CHIPS Act was passed, which was a $250 billion initiative, Congress-driven, bipartisan basis, to onshore semiconductor industry here in the United States, flash forward a few years, one of the biggest complaints has been permitting, the slowness of permitting. We've got a major new book out by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson called Abundance. And that's a central theme of his, that Democrats or Republicans who are talking about industrial policy and transforming industries, oftentimes it gets caught up in really gnarly local, state, and federal regulatory steps. And so there's a lot now on FDA's shoulders in a very complicated, ambitious thing.
Yeah, there is progress to be made. It should be looked at. I think it will require a little bit of time and some thoughtful understanding of why certain regulations are in place, which ones are important to ensure the ability of that plant to actually function well and to produce products that meet standards for safety and efficacy and quality. But there is more to be done in that regard. But I think we just have to do some of this work in a thoughtful, stepwise way, engaging the right experts, understanding the problems, listening to the concerns, and addressing them.
I want to shift a bit to Marty Makare's tenure. He took on his duties just recently, and there's a few themes that he's sounded. Some of them we've already looked at, but the themes are he wants to address what he regards as industry capture. of FDA, and we need to talk a bit about that. He wants to address regulatory creep that he sees. He's calling for speeding drug to markets, AI regulatory expansion. We've already talked a bit about that, and correcting the lower standard of foreign inspections. He wants to put a new focus on ultra-processed foods and chemical additives. That's very much in line with the Make America Healthy Again agenda of the secretary. And he said he wants to remove industry from scientific review, which means he wants that FDA advisory committees, he wants to rebuild trust in those advisory committees by alleging that the solution to that is to not permit industry to serve on these advisory committees. Say a bit about all of this. I mean, there's a lot I just wrapped up, but some of that's not at all surprising in the themes, but it's coming through very clearly that this notion of industry capture, push industry back on the regulatory side. You have the user fee question as proof of this, whereas FDA has been able to function half of its budget on user fees, regulatory creep. How do you respond when you hear those themes woven together in his speeches and interviews?
Yeah, well, I think that it is a concern. It certainly isn't the first time that these issues have been raised. And when I started at FDA, understanding the role that the user fees played and how that actually had allowed many processes to move more swiftly and efficiently and to modernize aspects of the work because the agency had been starved for resources for a very long time, but that there were bright lines. It wasn't like a company gives money for user fees and gets an automatic approval of their drug. And it's a very transparent process with negotiations between FDA and industry representatives. Stakeholder voices are engaged as well. And then Congress reviews it and legislation is passed. So it is clearly defined how these user fees are used, and it is demonstrated over the course of the history of their use that they have made a difference and have enabled reviews to be more efficient.
Do you think there's going to be
stronger.
Major change in the use of user fees?
And so, one question is, will user fees persist? In terms of the role of industry on advisory committees, there are certain expectations, and I can't tell you what's actually in law, but that there be representation of different stakeholders, and industry is certainly one. To me, what's most important on advisory committees is that you have people that actually bring expertise and appropriate experience and background to the table. Advisory committees are just that. They're advisory. They have no explicit required role in the final decision-making, but it's very useful to get that input. Advisory committees don't happen on every drug that's approved or every device or vaccine or biologic, but it is very useful, especially on some of the more complex, more emerging technologies, to get that expert opinion. And you want to get it, and you want to get it from wherever it exists. And if there might be a perception of conflict of interest, you want to explore it, and there can be waivers, but it is a transparent process about what the backgrounds of these people are. And to me, the critical thing is having the right knowledge and experience at the table. I think, I was always a bit concerned about the perception of revolving door, and I did everything I could to minimize it when I was commissioner. And when I left, I felt it was important to have a couple-year sort of cooling off period before I would join a board of a FDA-regulated company, because I felt, it was important to show that there wasn't that revolving door. But I think it's more perception in terms of what that means about the quality of scientific decision-making within FDA. I also think it's important to understand that when you look at medical product development and review, it isn't just what the FDA does. It's the companies that are developing these products. Often they have worked with academic researchers as well. But when people say it takes 10 to 12 years, that's not how long it takes for the FDA to review the application. That's how long it takes for the process to evolve. The majority of medical products that are being developed don't even make it to FDA review because they don't work and they don't meet standards. But there's real value if you want efficiency in the process of having FDA talking to industry and the product developers over the course of the research enterprise to define what are the best studies to do to be able to ask and answer the questions that FDA is ultimately going to be looking at when they do the review. You don't want huge studies to be done, and then when it comes to the FDA, they say, well, you didn't do the right study, so go back to the drawing board and another 10,000 people and find more opportunities to do that research, and it takes years. So I think we need to, again, be careful. I think we don't want it to become merged, of course, but what we want is the right engagement with the right guardrails and definition of respective roles and responsibilities that we can advance the science as rapidly as possible and help ultimately consumers get the products that they need and are counting on.
One of the worries that many people have with respect to FDA, but also to other institutions within the broader ecosystem of the biomedical R&D enterprise in our country, is about vaccines. There's a worry that there's a deep animus against vaccines, that it's buried or is emerged out of the post-COVID environment, that it translates into demands for more data on safety and efficacy, new studies, new requirements, and the like. Now, this is something that we've seen comment by some of the new leadership, like Vinay Prasad. Dr. Makary himself has spoken to this issue. Can you just say a bit about where vaccines sit here? Because that seems to be a hypersensitive matter right now.
Well, I think there was already a growing distrust of vaccines, and vaccine hesitancy issues were emerging pre-COVID, and they really came into stark illumination during COVID in terms of the concerns about the COVID vaccine, many concerned partly by the labeling of warp speed, but also the introduction of a totally novel vaccine strategy, and then all of the issues around conflict over mandates and ideologies about the role of government and public health versus individual rights. And so it all, really, I think, was a crucible to raise new concerns and questions about vaccines as a domain of work and question the value of vaccines. To me, it's a tragedy in that vaccines have proven to be one of the most important, not the most important, public health intervention of modern times. And we know the difference that they make. Vaccines are very well studied. There's great caution moving forward with new vaccines because you're actually giving a product to people who are well to protect against disease and disease spread, as opposed to treating a serious, perhaps fatal disease where people in society are willing to take on more risks. So vaccines historically have been very well studied, and they're monitored in their use after they have been approved and are in the marketplace so that if safety concerns emerge, they can be addressed. I think it's a huge problem for public health broadly in terms of how do we regain the trust and confidence, not just in vaccines, but more broadly in public health interventions and, in fact, in science. But it's something we all need to work on every day to earn back that trust and keep it.
FDA now operates in a different universe, right? You have the communications. FDA's communications have been reduced significantly. There's a push for centralization of communications into the Secretary's office at HHS. Secretary Kennedy has announced the MAHA Commission. The president announced this and appointed him to chair this. Dr. Makary is going to be part of that MAHA Commission. It's supposed to come up with a report, at least an initial report, in August. You have those two things, the centralization of communications, the creation of this new administration within the HHS, of the new Administration of American Health, and this commission approach. And you have the bigger question of the ecosystem of biomedical innovation, research and investment in biomedical innovation. And we had a very dramatic hearing 2 weeks ago, this Wednesday, where Senator Collins, in the chair of the Appropriations Committee, various dramatic testimony about how much this enterprise is being put at risk and how tied it is to U.S. national interests. We're moving ahead recklessly across many different agencies and not recognizing this. Say a few words about the MAHA Commission, this centralization, but also this bigger proposition that's been put forward about U.S. leadership in the broader enterprise and what's at stake and where are we heading?
Yeah. Again, I'm struck by some of the disconnects that are emerging, what I hope will not be failed opportunities because of the infliction of unfortunate damage to the knowledge, the infrastructure, the expertise, and the resources needed to support critical goals. We all want to see a healthier America, and there are many, many important things that we need to do to address it. And improving food and nutrition is certainly one of them. Better understanding environmental threats to health is another. And of course, developing a range of products that can help prevent, treat, and maybe cure serious disease is another important aspect of this. It is unfortunate that at the same time, the MAHA Commission is going to be looking at how do we strengthen work and policy and programs in some of these areas. Effectively, some of the critical agencies of government with expertise and ongoing work have been dismantled, whether it's NIH, at FDA, at CDC. So, I hope that as they look at this, the MAHA Commission, they'll realize that they need to help restore some of these important functions and capabilities in order to drive a science-based approach to making America as healthy as it can be, because ultimately we want interventions that will make a difference. And we need to do research. We need to apply evidence to that. And we need to implement in an urgent way on knowledge about what will make a difference. And many aspects of our ability to do that are now in some disarray. In addition, I am deeply worried about the issue you brought up at the end of our biomedical research and innovation enterprise. It's a complex ecosystem. And, we have actually been the envy of the world with quality of science and innovation that, really has been preeminent since World War II. And we are now seeing a wrecking ball coming to many aspects of that biomedical research enterprise, things that are certainly damaging ongoing research today that could be fundamental to our understanding of the mechanisms of disease and how best to treat, prevent, and cure. But we're also, I think, threatening the future because we're stopping training programs. We're creating an atmosphere of uncertainty where both industry and academia doesn't really know what the future is in terms of programs in this area. And certainly young researchers and trainees are second-guessing their choices and wondering, is there really a career path for me?
Right.
And this is very concerning. At the same time, we're seeing China emerging as a leader in this arena. And we're basically, I think, going to see a dramatic shift. It's already started of preeminence in terms of life sciences research. And this will have consequences, not just for us being able to be at the cutting edge of science, but also has economic implications. The biopharma industry is a huge driver of our economic prosperity, and it has security implications in terms of both national and international security. I hope that the new administration will take a deep breath and take a look at this and the broader context and begin to think about how can we stop the bleeding, and most importantly, how can we begin to repair and rebuild. And, this is a good chance now to do some things differently, and there are different models that we can look at and begin to develop, but we can't continue with this current approach, I don't think, without seriously compromising not just the health of our country, but our economic and physical safety and security.
Thank you so much. Peggy, we ask all of our guests to close with thoughts on what gives you optimism and hope. In this context, you've hinted at some of how you would answer that, but let's close with that. What gives you the greatest optimism and hope?
Well, this is a remarkable time in human history in terms of advances in science and technology and the opportunity to harness those for the public good. I think that we are shocked by some of what we're seeing happening to institutions that we had always felt were critical to our ability to actually advance science for people. My hope is that we will not give up on the knowledge that we can and will make a difference, and that this is a chance, as hard as it will be in many ways, to think about how to do it even better, to seek a path forward. The dust has to settle. We need to have better communication and discussion about what the harm has been and where the opportunities for recovery are, but recognizing that we don't want to just build what was. We want to do it differently, and change always comes hard, sometimes harder than other times. I hope we can come together around shared goals. And I've seen it happen before, even going back to my early days working with HIV/AIDS. It was very confrontational.
Right.
And it was very hard. But we actually all did sit down at the table and find a path forward. This is much bigger, much more complicated, more equities at stake, and more deep divides. But I take heart in having seen progress made under difficult circumstances before, that we can do it again. And somehow, as the British say, we'll muddle through.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Peggy, for your leadership. Thank you for the generosity you've shown and your contributions to the CSIS Bipartisan Alliance. Global Health Security, you've been very generous throughout, and we're very grateful for that. And thank you for making time to come in and be here today. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. And keep up your good work.
Thank you for listening to The Common Health. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a follow and leave a review. To learn more about the CSIS Bipartisan Alliance for Global Health Security or listen to other CSIS podcasts, please visit csis.org.